Okay, can you guys hear me okay? Yes. It's very hard to do anything after Peter Zumthor, I must say, one of my heroes. But firstly, let me just start by saying thank you very much for having me here. And namaste. It's wonderful to be back in India. It's been a wonderful journey that we've had in India so far. And today I really want to talk about, firstly, seeing and how we see things. So, you know, looking and seeing is very different things. Here are two of my favorite architects and heroes, Alvaro Siza, that says, you're transforming reality. You're not really inventing anything. Luis Barragan said, to see in such a way that vision is not overpowered by rational analysis. So the question is, how do we see the world? And one of the ways to think about that or to question that is looking at art. In 1826, this is what art looked like. A true artist was able to capture a moment as perfectly as they could through brushstrokes, in this case, oil on canvas. And that was the architecture that was associated with that period. Then in 1826, that very same year, the camera was invented, and things started changing because an artist had this potential to look for other things, to create something abstract. So if you were lucky enough to have this Kandinsky on your wall that was painted in 1911, then you'll probably see different things. And when you guys look at this, you probably all have different interpretations. You see different shapes. But also, if this hung in your house, you'd probably see different things every day depending on your state of mind. So there's a dialogue between yourself and the artwork. So this, in a way, is an interesting way to look at art. And when people ask us, how do we look at things, it becomes a very interesting question. So this is a photograph of a work by Fiona Banner. It's Harrier and Jaguar. And the photograph was taken by Tate. But I think it's an incredibly powerful photograph. It is this, obviously, commentary on war, which I'm not going to go into. But it's also this idea of this war machine, this very dynamic, powerful machine, really being quite stagnant, facing downwards, in a space that's actually kind of the opposite of it. And what I find is interesting about this is that there's a kind of a tension and a contrast, but it makes you see the aircraft differently, but it also makes you look at the architecture. You can see how the windows are responding to the wings, the light coming from above, and then for me, the biggest excitement about this photograph is that tip, just that tension between the floor and the nose of the plane. So using photographs, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we see things. So our studio is a collaborative studio. We've been working in over 90 countries across the planet. And what's interesting to me now, and that this journey that I want to share with you, is investigating the how. How do we see things? How do we interpret things and synthesize that in our architecture? So one of the idea threads that I found when I looked at the work was this idea of echoing. So this is quite a famous photograph by Matthias César, Daft Punk. It's in a Lautner building, also one of our heroes. But what's striking about it is the graphic of it, the negative space between, and the narrative behind it. There's a dialogue going on here between two masked people. Years later, I took this photograph in the Richtersveld, which is in South Africa where we're based. And I found it quite profound how the old tree, this ancient tree, is dying and a new tree is kind of found its same form, just looking at where the water is, where the wind is blowing from. And these crevices in the earth really shaped this tree. So there's a natural kind of progression and natural ability for things to find the right place. So this was a project that I did many, many years ago, about probably more than a decade ago. It was my first project in Europe. It's in Geneva, in an area called Colony. And the first instinct that I had when I walked around Switzerland was this incredible fluidity in the concrete work and the quality of the concrete work. And then the other thing is that we're used to having lots of light in South Africa. In Geneva, you have to celebrate and bring every little bit of heat and light into the project. So this was an early diagram, really starting to see how we can wash light into the project from the south, which is at the bottom of the page, into the project. Quite a tricky orientation, and the view is to the left of the image. Oh, sorry, you're right. So very, very initial conceptual diagram. I think I was listening to Portishead when I started modeling this, and I don't know if that had any effect on it. But we started seeing that the shape of this building might be informed by something in the context. So I was going through the site photographs and just noticed this quite important dip in the mountain. And through the seasons, every time that we went back to the site, that looked differently. Sometimes it was hardly visible. So we started this idea of echoing that mountain shape in the architecture. The first instinct was obviously to respond to the setbacks that were also angled. And how do we do this, and how do we sculpt this fluid concrete object to let the light in? So this is the final product. Moving around it, and the sculptural quality of that concrete actually comes to life as you move around the building. This is the arrival forecourt, so much more, shall we say, austere. This black metal blocks is really an art gallery that goes down into the land for about 3 stories. And you can see here again, allowing light to be washed in through the project. In the distance on the right, you can see the lake. Arriving at the building, so we often laugh at this because as South Africans, we're not even used to snow. And whenever I arrived at the building and during the snowy seasons, there was a little heap of snow under that circular opening, which we later resolved with a skylight or a glass element above that. But here you can see the front door in itself, a crafted object that again echoes the front gate into the project. And the door in itself becomes a piece of art. So we work very closely with Thierry Lemaire from Paris, who helped us with the interiors. And again, here you can see how the light's washing into the project. And then when you come to the lounge, the project opens up and you can see the Alps in the distance. So this kind of fluid quality washing through the project, but everywhere we can, we wash light into the space. The courtyard becomes a very protected space. Of course, we've got very cold northerly winds here. So this actually became later on a sculpture courtyard, animated by beautiful sculptures. And here you can see how the light is really celebrated and captured through the shape of the building. It's an interesting staircase. It goes through the art gallery, almost like a sinuous ribbon, 3 stories down. And when you're in the art gallery here, you can see this about 3 stories down underground, how much light we were able to wash into the space. And then exploring the fluidity of concrete also in the detailing. This is a wall in the spa that's almost expressed as a curtain. Subsequent to this photograph, the building's actually been almost overgrown by planting, which is really exciting for us. But you can see it still has a kind of a respect for the very traditional environment and really adhering to that shape that's driven by the authorities' envelope. The next project we're looking at very briefly is a project in Japan. So here you can see very clearly from every room we tried to mimic and capture and echo Mount Fuji in the background, bringing that into your experience. So the next theme, if I could call it that, is this idea of tension. So when you guys look at this photograph, I think there might be many things going through your mind. Of course, it's an aircraft, but is it landing or is it taking off? I think it depends a lot on your state of mind. And what I love about this photograph is that, you know, over the years, it's almost like the plane's made these markings on the floor, but there's a tension. It's either a tension of being freed, going into the air, or that moment before impact. So this tension comes through in our work sometimes as well when we look at the surroundings. So this next project is a house in Aspen that we've recently designed. Beautiful mountain range in the background. And looking at the context and some of the drivers and some of the clues, we looked at the old Aspen ski lodges, modern Aspen chalets, historic Aspen chalets. And you can see the materiality of that context, which we started analyzing and allowing this to inspire our work. So looking at that mountainscape, we started off by, again, creating an interesting roof plane and sculpting that roof plane in a way that not only referred back to the modern Aspen mountain chalets, but also the Silver Bell Peak, which is the main view of this building. So we're also faceting it, so we are creating an abstract reality here, looking at that mountain, giving it a new dimension. So this is a rendering on a snowy day, but then you can see as the weather clears up, what's exciting for us about it is that you're looking at your environment in a different way. You're looking at that negative space, between the mountain and the roof is shaped really to give that tension between natural and man-made. Looking back at the mountain, of course, it's in a foresty environment, but I even enjoy the way that one can see through the building back to the forest. And then, of course, bringing natural landscapes and meadows back onto the roof of the project, allowing nature to take over the building, much like the previous project. So, of course, we implement passive cooling. We want to be quite respectful. We respect energy. We want to conserve it through our work. But again, here you can see a relationship between the mountain, but also the river below. And when you're in that river looking back at the building, you can start seeing how that ceiling actually becomes a very important part of our language. Upon arrival of the project, the building is slightly subdued, and as you come around to the front door, you get that first glimpse, a lot like the Geneva project, but interpreted in a very different way, and then the stone cladding that you also saw in the historic photographs. Looking back at the front door, but also, again, getting glimpses up to the mountain peaks behind, and then just trying to imagine what this building could be like in the different seasons. I think landscaping is becoming more and more important in our work, and it's prevalent in many of the projects that I'm going to talk about today. This photograph is quite interesting. Again, you pick it up, there's a tension. Shall we call it a narrative about law enforcement, the idea of uniform. The smallest character, the smallest stormtrooper is the most challenging. Uniform allows you to do that. But again, it's this echoing, two different things talking to one another. So this project is a project in Madeira, again, a residential project that we also designed about 10 years ago. So this is under construction. And it's on a very, very steep hill on the island of Madeira. So the first instinct was obviously to have a building that cascades down this landscape. But again, looking at the site photographs, we started noticing things. And this is the way we see things to allow us to inform ourselves. So looking at that coastline, we started shaping the roof. So it sounds like quite an obvious approach, but the sculptural quality comes out in that because even at the entrance, you start feeling the tension between different elements. And it helps you to see things in a different way and appreciate things. In a very similar way, this is a project that we're doing in Senegal at the moment in a town called Sindia. As you know, I think in India it's also very important, but in South Africa and Africa, trees play an incredibly important role. They kind of have this, they're a meeting place, they represent the elders, very strong spiritual connections with trees. So of course, when we were designing in this baobab forest, there are only 2 trees or so that are really large enough, but we wanted to celebrate and hug those trees. Again, using a similar curve that we did in Madeira, but then also looking at traditional architecture, very organic, really working around these trees very respectfully. So this site has inherent tension in it. On the one hand, there's a residential sprawl that's coming from the east, agricultural land to the south, and then a nature reserve to the north and the west. So these tensions for me are quite interesting, and how we implement and interpret this became one of the driving factors of this design. So inside, we're using the land and rammed earth format to create and sculpt these spaces, very much like the traditional way, but obviously reinterpreted, and then always respectful to the trees. And this is a resort, and just going through some of the spaces here, we're introducing weaving culture in the way that we make the spaces, but really also just creating really lovely protected spaces from the harsh harmattan conditions. On this resort, they'll have animals, and of course they're drawn to the water, so the hotel rooms themselves are actually aligned along that so that people can kind of appreciate the animals coming to the water. Again, holding the tree, this is the entrance to the spa. And again, another example where we use tension. So this is a heavy, heavy earth wall on the left, and then a very fluid concrete wall, similar to that Geneva project again, where we're almost expressing something that's quite solid as something that's quite fluid. And you can see how that gives access to the treatment rooms on the right-hand side. So context matters. I think when you see a photograph like this, you start looking at things slightly differently. If you're in the subway, you would feel quite uncomfortable. And it's because of these kind of space shoots in that unnatural context in a way. So when we started working in Japan about 5 years ago, we again looked at that context and tried to understand how we can implement this in our work and interpret it in our work, synthesize it in a contemporary way, but something that's also part of our DNA. How do you capture that soul of a place, but in a completely new way, not copying the old way? So we started off looking just at a very typical Japanese house, of course, inverting the roof angle, allowing that roof angle to present itself on plan as well. And you can see, similar to the Geneva project, washing light down as deep as we can into the project. So this project is a house in the heart of Japan, of Tokyo. And other than we bouncing the light in, of course, we started using those blades also to protect the building from noise. This is quite a busy road, but also scooping light in and providing acoustic protection to the building and privacy. And our next project goes to Miami, where we implemented a similar idea. So this is North Bay, USA. So here you have to do with these kind of series of small archipelagos or islands in the water. So there's this inherent tension between water and land. It's land that's been reclaimed. And there was an artist, Robert Smithson, who did this artwork. Unfortunately, it never came to life, but you'll recognize his work, the Spiral Jetty, that he did implement, a landscape art, but he wanted to create these shards, literally a shard island in Miami between these islands. So consciously or subconsciously, this inspired the work, and when we were designing this house, we looked at art, the owner's art collector, and using these shards almost as places where this art collector can display his art. The building can be approached from the land side, but also from the water side. And similar to the Japan project, of course, we had these shards connecting the front and the back of the building or the site, allowing the site to run right through the design. But this also started happening on section. So the roofs do the same thing. And what excites us about this is that you get a sculptural quality when you move around the building towards the approach of it. And this takes us to another detail project that we did in Cheetah Plains. So this was done collaboratively with ARC, which is our sister company, primarily focused on interiors. So you'll see a lot of interior work. So this is, again, a resort in a very beautiful area called Sabi Sand in South Africa. And in the beginning, there was just the watering hole on the left. And we started walking the site and noticed these very prevalent acacia trees. In Afrikaans, they call it pendurings. And how they're kind of prevailing on the site. Consciously, subconsciously, this found its way into our design. So we started sketching. And here you can see the first plans developing. But this, and looking at this element in nature, actually inspired quite a lot of the work. So it became not only the light fittings, we looked at the seed pods, which informed how we made the lights. All of these things are made in South Africa, all relatively close to the site. So how do you capture the soul or the essence or the atmosphere of a place? Through architecture, and this is what we tried to explore here. So really quite raw materials. We love this idea of finding the elements in nature, that kind of barefoot luxury, to come into the project so you can see those forms reoccurring in even the furniture pieces that we designed. The lighting elements that's handcrafted, and a lot of this work happened on site. So coming back to that idea, as per the previous two projects, an idea that's happening on section, a detail element informing the plan. And here you can experience some of that. So it's called Cheetah Plains. This is the main entrance building. And as you walk into the building, you can start seeing the materials and the rawness of the materials coming to life here. And on the left-hand side there, you can see a tree, almost like an artificial tree. You spoke a little bit about the trees, and I'll talk about it more. But really taking these very, very natural, raw elements and creating a luxury resort, which was really the brief in this case. So what's remarkable here, if you do come and visit this, is you can see cheetahs and all kinds of wild animals walking right up to the water in this position. So another place that we've been working in quite actively is Lagos, Nigeria. And one of the things that we notice if you ever visit Nigeria, you see a lot of these boats, and it's wonderfully ingenious how the local people create these sails just using old bags, and that's their livelihood. So this was one of our first tall buildings that we were commissioned to do. It's on Borderline Road, which is quite an important road in Nigeria, in Lagos, Ikoyi. And you can see that shape coming to life through the architecture. But then again, as per the Cheetah Plains project, starting to look at details around us, allowing that to inform, in this case, the shading technique on the building. And it's not monodimensional, it's layered. Of course, all done on a very, very tight budget. But the effect from the inside is that you have quite a comfortable inside environment, of course, taking care of lots of the heat gain that one can expect in a glass building in a very hostile environment. But it's almost like putting on sunglasses. And the entrance, I mean, this was designed some time ago, but what was, again, for me interesting is how one can imagine this being a tree, the place where you gather, and the canopy of the building really pulls up, inviting people into the project, the more public fronting part of the project at least. So trees. This is a baobab tree photographed in Tanzania by Christopher Wilson. Over the years when I looked at our work, trees have played a significant role, sometimes in a very literal way. So this was a sushi bar, a restaurant that we designed on top of one of the hotels that we had completed previously in Dakar. So you can see how that idea has come through very, very strongly, basically just creating a sense of shelter, but reinterpreting in an abstract way. For the same client, we designed a house in Geneva that was doing the same thing, but in a very abstract way. So here you can see this idea of creating shelter, and there's this fascinating balance and, again, tension between a heavy stone wall and this element that almost just balances on that stiletto heel, like the tree's trunk, and that is the place where shelter happens. And that's where this family and their friends gather. The next project has, again, this theme, shall we say, of different worlds coming together. So on the one hand, we've got multi-residential housing projects to the bottom left, a very strong industrial component, and on the right, agriculture. So this is in an area called Harburg, which is part of Hamburg. And for those of you who've been to Hamburg, it's dominated by these very strong industrial canals, and our site is no exception. So we were approached here to do a low to medium income housing project, and it was all driven by a new subway station that was built close by. So there you can clearly see our site. It used to be an old rubber factory, and our first instinct was, again, like I said right in the beginning of this talk, to look around, to see what's around us that can inform us to understand this thing and unpack it. So, of course, very strong culture of brickwork, steel, concrete, and this was our proposal. So we had to work within an urban design framework very strictly, but we managed to convince them to change this canal, because the canal doesn't have to function the way it used to in a kind of an industrial context. It wasn't just to offload and unload, upload things from the ships. It can now be a place where ecosystems can actually come back into the canal. And you can see how the building, although it adhered to all the rules that the urban designer gave us, it actually managed to just push some boundaries. One of them is this idea of connecting the roofs, so we can build running tracks over the roof, have some urban agriculture, basketball courts, etc. But you can see the materiality, the concrete almost spilling up the building into the plinths. And then, of course, shops opening up towards the public interface of the project. And in this case, the promenade, so you can see these are restaurants that open up. And the insides of the courtyards are expressed in a ceramic panel, which is also driven by really what you see when you walk around Hamburg. And we managed to convince them that we can bend these facades really to animate them, but to actually create this effect of layering on the facades. So there's just a very rough section. You can see there's a super basement, of course, shops that open up right at the top, shared amenities for the roof, and then you can see how those materials influence our work. Again, I spoke about the courtyards, bringing color into the courtyards, so each courtyard's a different color. And when you walk around Hamburg, you do see these kind of glazed and colored ceramics, which we thought was quite interesting to inspire our project. All right, the next theme is mass and erosion, another photograph that I took many, many years ago in the Richtersveld in South Africa. So what one doesn't realize is the scale of these things. But for me, what's interesting about it is these elements were shaped over years. Nature shaped them, and there's a kind of a balance and a harmony, almost like a harmonious tension between elements. And this site takes us back again to Dakar, Senegal. We're working on the coastline, and we were approached to essentially build a typical apartment building. You can see the position there. It's kind of sloping down towards the ocean. And when you visit Dakar, this part of town is very important because this is where people come to run, come for walks. They exercise together, which is really something to see. And of course, this is the connection to the ocean. So that promenade is very important to Senegal and Dakar. But when you walk the streets of Dakar, you see lots of craftsmanship. You see craftsmanship in stone. You see it in timber. You definitely see it in even mud work. So they create these Adobe sun-baked bricks. And when you look further down the coast in Cap Manuel, this is a basalt rock formation that was over the years eroded through nature. So subconsciously, this definitely played a role when we started organizing the building. So starting off with a very simple mass, we sliced it open to create the main entrance, and then started displacing the facades, mostly due to practical considerations, but also sculpting them. So this video shows it a little bit more clearly, starting off with a very simple site, excavation, creating the mass, and then very importantly, eroding the mass to give it that presence that it has. I'll talk about it a little bit later, but this project we managed to, again, convince the client to use the soil from the land to make this building. And as you swing around it, this is the side of the road. You can see the building solidifying towards the side. And you can see how that almost like crevice in the building is expressed. So talking about local materials, we, as many architects at the moment, are looking to try and incorporate as much as we can of the local materials. So although it's not like you walk around Dakar and see many of these mud structures, but the technology and the idea is definitely there. And using rammed earth, we convinced the client to actually use that for the external structure. And on the inside, we're using those Adobe bricks, as well as Taifa panels for insulation and ceilings. And we managed to use approximately 64% of the soil on the land to make these walls. So that's the end result. You can see, again, themes that we spoke about earlier, this idea of a very light canopy over the top, a tree, very heavy base, almost like that's been eroded over time, and creating slot openings for ventilation. And one thing that we tried here that actually I think will express this idea quite clearly is that we creating these inner panels of the entrance with reusable steel shutters, and we intentionally creating quite a sheen on them so that the rest of the building can be quite crusty and raw in a way. This is the shared amenities on the roof, where you get the ocean views to the Atlantic. And we spoke about it being on this promenade, so we love the idea of the building having an opening at the bottom that allows people to come and enjoy the building and the view as well. And you can see how that shape, that entrance shape, is actually made, again, abstracted from what we see around us on the site and in nature. And you see that again on this coastline. So again, this idea of echoing nature and things that we see around us and how we synthesize that into the experience that people can actually enjoy that in the architecture. So just a rough organization of the building. So all the yellowish spaces are public spaces, and of course they are positioned in a way where the public can actually access this building and also enjoy this quite remarkable position on the site. We had to push the building down slightly so that we can maintain a kind of a relationship to the city beyond, but also have those views out towards the ocean and just have the building nestled into that portion of the land quite comfortably. The corners open up to the views, and we allow some planting to again be reintroduced onto this, which is really the health and fitness level, and giving you views back towards the city. Staying on the theme of mass and erosion, this was another photograph that I took in Richtersveld, and I think here you can start understanding or feeling the scale of this place, and how over years and years and years, these massive structures, you look at the scale of the tree there, these massive structures were formed. So being in these environments, you kind of start wondering how much this influences the way you look at the work. So I was quite intrigued also by that sheltered space underneath this rock. So that for me can be a building. It's an inspiration for a building. And when we were approached to design in Saudi, This is a spa that we're busy with at the moment. Some of those ideas came to life, also creating this sense that you're almost eroding away in the rock and creating vistas out to the mountains in the distance. So for me, it's almost like the building grew out of these rocks, and you start experiencing, obviously, these axes, but in a very, very simple, raw way, creating you a relationship between the visitor and this place, and creating a tension, where you start appreciating the landscape and the land more. We try and bring that thought of respect into our work, whether it's sustainable design, whether it's looking at the places, looking at heritage. But I think what we're trying to do is give people a different way of looking at their surroundings. And as Maya Lin said, that for her is art. Thank you very much.